I have been carrying a secret that would get me laughed out of every room I've ever sat in. Doctors, scientists, the kind of people who wear lanyards and speak at conferences, they would say, I was delusional. A man alone too long in the woods, they'd say. Grief does strange things to the mind. And maybe they'd be right about a lot of things. But they weren't there. They didn't hear what I heard on those 3 nights in November. They didn't look into those eyes and see something looking back that understood exactly what was happening. I did. And I've kept my mouth shut about it for 19 years because I valued what little reputation I had left. But I'm 71 now, and my cardiologist used a word last spring that made me reconsider what I'm willing to take to my grave. So here I am. My name is Dale Kowalski. I spent 22 years in the United States Army, 2 tours in places I won't name, and I have been living alone on 43 acres of wooded hill country in northern Pennsylvania since 2001. What I'm about to tell you happened on and around that property, starting in the spring of 2005 and ending in a way I still cannot fully explain in the winter of 2007. I have never spoken about this publicly. I have told one person, my sister Linda, who passed in 2019, and took it with her the way good people take things. I am telling you now because I would rather be judged by strangers online than have this story disappear entirely. You should also know, and I realize this part is going to sound strange, coming from a man who just told you he encountered something most people don't believe exists, but I have been told by my nephew that I need to say something here about liking the video and subscribing to the channel. I genuinely do not understand how any of this works. He set this whole thing up. He told me people watch confessions on their phones while they're eating lunch. I find that remarkable. I was in the Army before the internet existed in any form I recognized. And now, apparently, a 71-year-old man talking into a camera in his kitchen is considered entertainment. So, if you're eating lunch, hello. If there's a button somewhere that you push to follow along, my nephew says you should push it. He also told me the algorithm, and he said that word, like it was a person, the algorithm needs to know you're interested. I don't know what that means. But there it is. Now let me tell you what happened in the spring of 2005, because that is where this story begins. Even though I didn't understand it as a beginning at the time, I thought it was just a Tuesday. I had a trap line I ran through the eastern edge of my property, about 1.5 miles into the tree line, mostly for nuisance animals, coyotes that had been harassing a neighbor's livestock, the occasional fox. I'd done this work for years, knew the land the way you know the rooms of a house you've lived in for decades, could walk it in the dark without a flashlight, and some mornings I did exactly that. That particular morning in late April 2005, I was out just before sunrise, the ground still cold, but the air carrying that first real hint of green warmth that comes when the season finally decides to commit. I had 4 snares set across a dry creek bed where coyotes had been traveling. I checked the first 3. Nothing. The 4th one I heard before I saw it. Not barking, not growling. A sound I had no category for at the time, high and thin and almost rhythmic, like something between crying and a question. I pushed through a stand of young birch and stopped dead. There was something in the snare. The wire had caught it at the ankle, and it had clearly been there for some hours because the ground around it was torn up in a rough circle where it had been pulling and spinning. My first thought, genuinely, was that it was a child. That was how my brain processed it in the first half second. Small enough. Upright enough. 2-limbed in the way it was favoring its unsnared leg. But it wasn't a child. It was approximately the size of a 2-year-old human, and it was fully covered, no bare skin visible anywhere, and dark, reddish-brown hair that was matted and muddy from the night on the ground. Its face was the thing I couldn't file away. broad, flatter than an ape's, but with a nose that sat differently than any primate he'd seen in photographs, and eyes. Dark amber, almost copper, and they tracked me with an intelligence that hit me like cold water. It went completely still when it saw me. Not the freeze of a frightened animal. It went still the way a person goes still when they're deciding something. I stood there for what felt like a long time. Maybe 30 seconds. It watched me. I watched it. And then it made that sound again, shorter this time, questioning, and I looked down at its ankle and saw the wire had bitten into the flesh, and the leg below the snare was swollen and dark. I made a decision in that moment that I have spent 19 years second-guessing, not because it was wrong, but because of everything it set in motion. I knelt down slowly, set my rifle on the ground beside me where I could reach it, but where it wasn't pointed at anything, and I said out loud, "To this thing I had no name for, I'm not going to hurt you. I know you don't understand me, but I'm going to get that wire off your leg. It didn't run. It watched my hands the entire time I worked the snare loose, and it took nearly 4 minutes because the wire had twisted, and when the pressure finally released and I sat back on my heels, it looked at its own ankle, then looked at me, and then it did something I was not prepared for. It reached out and touched the back of my left hand with 3 fingers. Not a scratch, not a grab, a touch, like it was confirming I was real. Then it pulled back and was gone into the brush in under 2 seconds, faster than anything I'd seen move on 2 legs, and I sat there in the cold dirt for a long time before I picked up my rifle and walked home. I told myself it was a juvenile. That was the word my brain kept offering as a filing system. Juvenile unknown species, some kind of primate, some impossible holdover, something that science hadn't found yet. I had 22 years of military training and 40 years of wilderness experience, and the word my brain kept producing was juvenile, because that was less terrifying than the word I wouldn't let myself use yet. I set the snares on that line the following morning out of habit, then pulled them all before noon. I don't know exactly why. I just knew I wasn't going to run that line anymore. Something had changed in the geometry of the land, and I couldn't explain it better than that. I spent the next 4 days going about my normal routines, cutting firewood, checking the roof on my barn, driving into town for supplies, and I didn't see anything unusual. But I heard things. Twice in those 4 days, once at dusk, and once around 2 in the morning, I heard that sound. The high, thin, crying question sound. Each time it came from the eastern tree line, which is the direction of the dry creek bed where Id found the snare. Each time it came once, then stopped, like a signal, or a check-in. I did not go out to investigate. I am not an idiot. Or rather, I am sometimes an idiot, but am a measured one. I understood that whatever that juvenile was, it had not come alone to these woods. Something had brought it here, was responsible for it in some fashion, and going out in the dark toward that sound was a decision that only ended one way. So I didn't. But on the 5th night after Id freed it, I stepped out onto my back porch just before dark to check the weather, and they were there. 2 of them. Standing at the far edge of my back field, roughly 80 yards out, at the exact point where the mown grass meets the tree line. The one on the left was the juvenile. I could tell by the size and by the way it was standing slightly behind the larger one shoulder angled back in the posture of a creature that has been protected and knows it. The larger one, and when I say larger I mean I am 6 feet and 210 pounds, and this thing was taller than me and wider through the chest than any man I've ever stood beside. The larger one was still in a way that was not passive. It was the stillness of assessment. It looked at me for a long time. I didn't move. I didn't reach for anything. I stood on my porch with my hands visible, the way you stand when you're trying to communicate the absence of threat. And I thought about the juvenile's 3 fingers on the back of my hand, and I thought, this is the parent. This is why the little one didn't run screaming when a human knelt over it in the dark. Someone had taught it that not all things with 2 legs were dangerous, or maybe it figured that out on its own. Either way, here they were. The large one stood motionless for perhaps 90 seconds. Then it made a sound I will try to describe, but probably cannot do justice to low, not loud, more felt in the chest than heard by the ear, like the first second of thunder before you realize it's thunder. And then they were both gone. The field was just the field. The tree line was just the tree line. And I stood on my porch in the cooling evening air and understood, with a certainty that I cannot justify logically but have never doubted, that something had just been communicated and that it was approximately the following: I know what you did for mine. I see you. We are even. And I stood there long after the light was gone and I said, to no one, out loud, all right then. And that was how it started. The first months were surveillance, though I wouldn't have called it that at the time. I called it awareness. I knew they were there, in the eastern woods, and I began to pay attention to the signs of that presence the way you pay attention to a neighbor you've had one significant interaction with, not friendship, not hostility, just a heightened noticing. I found prints in the mud along the creek bed, twice. The juveniles were small enough that at a glance you might convince yourself they were a large dog's, if you didn't look too carefully, and if you had never seen a dog walk upright. The large one's prints were another matter. I measured one on a clay-heavy bank where it had come down to the water in the night 14.5 inches long, 7 inches across the ball of the foot, 5 distinct toe impressions without claws. I stared at that print for a while. I took no photographs. I'm not sure why. Part of it was the instinct, still present from military service, to not create evidence of things that could be used against you. Part of it was something more complicated that I'm still not fully sure I understand, a sense that documenting it was a kind of violation, the way it would feel wrong to photograph a stranger's grief. Through June and into July, I began to notice a pattern. Every 3 to 4 nights, there were signs of them along the eastern edge of the property prints: disturbed grass, once a half-eaten white-tailed deer left at the tree line with a precision of consumption that no predator I knew of accomplished. Not messy, the way coyotes eat, organized. The carcass laid parallel to the tree line as if placed, the parts that had been consumed removed cleanly. The deer had not been shot. The neck had been broken. I stood over that carcass on a cold July morning and thought about what it meant that something in my eastern woods could break a deer's neck and eat in an organized fashion and place what remained at the edge of my property like a statement. I decided it was not a threat. Looking back, I can see I was probably in a phase of motivated reasoning. I wanted it not to be a threat, so I interpreted everything through that lens. But I still think I was right. It wasn't a threat, it was communication, a demonstration. This is what we are. This is what we can do. And here is the part that surprised me. I answered. I left food at the tree line 2 days later. Not as an offering, in any ritualistic sense, I am not that kind of man. As an acknowledgement, 1.5 pounds of venison from my own freezer, left at the exact point where the deer carcass had been placed. When I checked the next morning, it was gone. Not scattered, not dragged gone, the way you pick something up and carry it, cleanly. And that night, for the first time, I heard that juvenile sound not from the eastern woods, but from my back field, closer than it had ever been. A question. I was sitting on my porch with a coffee, and I answered it the only way I knew how. I didn't go inside. I didn't turn on more lights. I just sat there in the dark and let myself be visible and non-threatening, and after a while, the sound stopped and the field was quiet, and I finished my coffee and went to bed. This went on through the rest of the summer. A gradual, careful, mutually managed approach, like two people who have agreed to trust each other but are taking their time about it. I never pushed for proximity. I always let them set the terms of engagement. This was not altruism. This was what my Army training would have called respecting the operational capabilities of an unknown entity. But over time, the protocol began to feel like something else. It began to feel like courtesy. By September, the juvenile, I had not yet given them names, I was resisting that had come to within 30 feet of my back porch twice in the early morning hours, when the field was covered in mist, and the light was gray and everything felt provisional. Both times I was there already, having gotten up early the way old men do, and both times the juvenile stood at the edge of the mist and looked at me with those amber eyes, and I looked back. And nothing happened except that we both existed in the same space without catastrophe. That was more than I could say for most of my human relationships at the time. I had been divorced for 8 years. My closest friend from the Army, a man named Curtis, had died of a stroke in 2003. My sister Linda called on Sundays, and I was grateful for that, but it was thin, the contact. I was, in the truest sense, alone on those 43 acres, and the loneliness was not something I talked about or even fully admitted to myself because I had chosen it. I had driven away from a marriage and a city and a career, and I had chosen the silence, and it seemed dishonest to then complain about it. But here, in the mist, 30 feet from my porch, was something alive that did not fear me and did not require anything from me except that I stay still. I'm not going to pretend that didn't matter. It mattered enormously. I named the juvenile Cain. I know how that sounds. I want to explain it. When I finally allowed myself to name him, and I say him because over time there were physical details that supported that. Though I won't belabor them, I spent 2 days thinking about what to call him. I rejected names that were too cute, too domesticated. Anything that would have made him a pet in my own internal framework. I rejected names from nature, river, stone, things like that because they felt like I was trying to make him a metaphor rather than an individual. I settled on Cain for the same reason I would have given a soldier a straightforward name without commentary because it fit. There was something in him that was both chosen and cast out. Something that existed on the boundary between the known world and the unmapped one. And he had that mark, the way Cain has the mark a patch of lighter hair across his left shoulder blade, irregular, roughly the size of my palm, that stood out against the dark reddish-brown of the rest of him. It was identifiable from 30 feet. It was his. I named the large one the parent, or guardian, the one whose relationship to Cain I was never completely certain of. Though the protectiveness was unmistakable, I named her Abel. I know that inverts the mythology, and I did it deliberately, because she was not the violent one, not at first, not for a long time. She was the patient one, the watchful one, the one who established the rules, whatever those rules were, and enforced them without drama. She was the one who decided I was acceptable, and once she had made that decision, she held to it with a consistency that was more than animal, and I always knew it. Abel was large. I estimated 7.5 feet when standing fully upright, though she rarely did in open ground, seeming to prefer a slight forward lean that distributed her height differently. The hair was darker than Cain's, almost black across the shoulders and crown, lightening to the reddish-brown at the extremities. Her hands, I am going to say hands because the word fits better than paws or forelimbs. Her hands were enormous, the fingers long, and the grip, on the one occasion I saw her grip something in my presence, was absolute. She broke a 4-inch cedar branch once, during the second year, to clear a path through a section of fence I had never quite gotten around to fixing, and she did it the way you'd break a pencil. Just to illustrate a point, I never forgot the sound of that branch. By late October of 2005, they were coming to the tree line near my porch almost every other evening. Not approaching beyond a certain point, perhaps 25 feet from the porch steps, was the closest, and that was Cain, not able but present. Visible in the last light, then invisible in the dark but audible if I was listening. The juvenile sounds, the low chest thunder from Abel. I began to leave food more consistently. Not to establish dependency, I was careful about that, but because the deer were moving to winter grounds and I had a sense the eastern woods were not as rich in game as the deeper forest. I left venison, mostly, and once a bucket of fish I'd taken from the creek that I knew wouldn't keep another day in my cooler. The fish were gone in under an hour. Cain made a sound that night that was new shorter, with an upward lift at the end that I can only describe as satisfied. I sat on my porch in the cold October dark and laughed for the first time in a while, and the sound of my own laughter in the silence surprised me. By November, I had stopped pretending this was a wildlife observation project or a naturalist's curiosity. I was in a relationship of some kind with two beings that should not have existed according to everything I had been taught about the world, and it was the most meaningful connection I had to anything living, and I understood that this said as much about my life as it did about them. That understanding did not make me stop. It made me more careful about it. I began keeping a journal in a composition notebook I bought in town, writing entries in a private shorthand I'd developed in the Army for field notes, using coordinate-style notations and time codes rather than plain language in case anyone ever found it. Reading it now, it looks like the work of someone with a head injury, but I know what it means. By year one's end, Cain had come close enough to take food from a bowl I'd left on the porch railing. He didn't take it while I was there. He waited until it'd gone inside, but I watched from the kitchen window. He picked the bowl up with both hands and tipped it back like a cup. That image is in me the same way certain things from the war are in me permanent, high definition, available at a moment's notice for the rest of my life. The second year was the golden year, and I wish I could make you understand what that was. After 22 years of military service and a marriage that ended because I could not figure out how to be in a room with another human without eventually making it smaller, I found a version of companionship that asked almost nothing of me except presence and consistency. In the mornings, I would go about my work, the property maintenance, the firewood, the small repairs that a 43-acre place requires in an endless rotation, and sometimes, in the peripheral vision of the eastern tree line, there would be movement. Not threatening, just parallel. The way a dog moves alongside you on a trail without being told to. Cain began to appear in daylight regularly by the spring of 2006. Not in the open field, he was careful about exposure, and Abel's influence on that carefulness was evident, but at the tree line, in the dappled morning light where the shadows were generous. He was growing. By spring of that second year, I estimated him at 4.5 feet standing upright, broader through the chest than he'd been when I found him in the snare, the hair filling out from the thin juvenile coat to something denser and darker. He moved differently, too, less of the tentative, careful movement of the early months, more of something that I can only call confidence. He had a quirk I noticed by April and confirmed by May. He collected things. Small, interesting objects that caught his attention on the property. A piece of broken blue glass from a mason jar. Ida dropped near the barn. A silver spoon that had been my late mother's, and that Id knocked off a fence post and forgotten. 2 shotgun shell casings that Id ejected near the fire pit. He didn't take them for utility. He arranged them. I found his arrangement spot in June, under the overhang of a large shelving rock near the creek bed shells placed parallel to each other, glass positioned where the afternoon light caught it, spoon laid flat beside a small piece of white quartz he'd brought from somewhere. A collection. Curated. I sat on a log 20 feet away and looked at it for a long time. I said, to him he was somewhere behind me in the trees. I could hear the soft contact sounds of movement. I said, "You've got good taste, kid." And there was a huff from the trees that I have decided, in the absence of any better interpretation, to call laughter. I left the objects exactly as they were. I never touched that arrangement. By summer of 2006, Abel was spending evenings within 50 feet of the porch, sometimes closer. She never came up to the porch the way Cain occasionally did in the very early morning, but she would lower herself to a sitting position at the tree line, and she would be there in the blue-gray of evening, and I would sit on my porch steps with a coffee, and we would coexist in the summer dark. I want to say something carefully here. I never stopped being aware of what she was. I never romanticized it into something it wasn't or forgot what that cedar branch sounded like when she broke it. The calculus of risk was always present in my thinking, the way it's always present when you work with anything powerful: chainsaw, high-caliber rifle, a river and flood. You respect the capability and you work inside it rather than pretending it doesn't exist. But within that awareness there was something real. She would look at me across the field and I would look at her, and there was a quality to that looking that I am going to call recognition, because no other word fits. She knew who I was, not just what I was. Who? That distinction matters to me. In August, there was an incident with a neighboring hunter, a man named Pruitt, who ran deer on the property 2 parcels over, and whose dogs occasionally found their way through my eastern fence. His dogs came through on a Thursday afternoon, 2 of them running a scent, and they got into the eastern woods before I could head them off. I spent 45 minutes tracking and calling before I got them turned around and pushed back through the fence. They were clearly terrified, not excited, hunting terrified, a different register entirely. They ran for home without looking back, and Pruitt came to collect them the next day and said they'd cowered under his porch all night and wouldn't eat. He looked at me like I might have an explanation. I told him there was a bear in the eastern section and that his dogs had probably gotten upwind of it. He accepted that. There was no bear, and for the first time I understood that the existence of Abel and Cain on my property was not just a wonder, but a liability that the world they moved through was also the world other people moved through, and that collision was not a matter of if but when, and that I was now the only buffer between those 2 worlds. I had not signed up for that responsibility, but I had taken it on the day I knelt in the mud and unsnared a juvenile's ankle, and there was no revision available. Let me tell you about the things I got wrong in that second year, because I was getting things wrong even in the middle of the golden period, and I didn't see it until much later. The first was food. I had started leaving food at the tree line as a sign of goodwill, and over the months it had become a routine, and routines create expectations, and expectations in a wild thing create behavioral patterns that are nothing like wildness. I was not thinking in those terms at the time. I was thinking they come, I leave food, they take it, transaction, kindness. What I was actually doing was creating a dependence that would, 2 years later, manifest in ways I was not prepared for. The second mistake was proximity normalization. When Cain began appearing at the porch railing in the early mornings, and I responded by leaving food there rather than at the tree line, when I essentially moved the relationship closer, because it was more convenient and because, if I am being honest, I liked having him close. I was changing the terms of an agreement that I had not fully understood I was making. Animals are not static. They learn. They calibrate. What is acceptable today becomes the floor tomorrow. I don't blame Cain for that. That's not blame. That's just how learning works, and he was learning faster than I was. The third mistake was Abel, not Abel herself, but my reading of her. I had decided she was the stable one, the reliable one, the constant against which everything else could be measured. I had assigned her the role of adult in my internal narrative, the competent authority who set limits and maintained them. Looking back, I can see that I was projecting. I was writing her a character based on what I needed her to be, not what she was demonstrating. And what she was demonstrating, if I had been reading it without the overlay of what I wanted to see, was a growing restlessness that had nothing to do with me. There were nights in the late summer of 2006 when I heard sounds from the eastern woods that were new, longer vocalizations, more complex, with the call and response quality of communication rather than the single-note check-ins I'd grown used to. I convinced myself it was Cain's developing voice, him learning to range further, normal juvenile behavior. I told myself this firmly enough that I believed it for months. What I should have asked myself, and this is the question I've sat with for 19 years, was, who was she responding to? Because Abel did not make those calls into the dark for no one. She was answering something I could not hear, and something was answering her. Year 3 began in spring of 2007, and it had a different quality from the start, though I would not have admitted that to myself at the time. The most accurate word for it is charged. The air between the eastern woods and my property felt charged the way it feels before a storm, not wrong exactly, but altered, weighted. Cain was larger again, noticeably, and the growth had changed him in ways that I was slow to account for. He was close to 6 feet now, broad and powerful in the shoulders, the juvenile lightness replaced by something denser. He still had his collection under the shelving rock. He still made those upward-lifting, satisfied sounds when there was food he liked. But there was a new thing, a watchfulness that was different from curiosity. He would look past me sometimes, over my shoulder toward the house or toward the road, with an intensity that wasn't fear. It was more like calculation. I told myself, he's getting older, he's more aware, this is growth. This is exactly what I told myself. In April, I found the first sign I could not rationalize. On the north side of my property, which is the side that faces the county road, and which is the furthest point from the eastern woods, I found prints. Not one set, 4 sets, multiple individuals. The smallest was larger than Abel's. 3 of the 4 were considerably larger than anything I'd seen on my property before. The prints deep pressed into soft spring mud, as if made by something very heavy, moving with intention. They ran along the entire north fence line and stopped at the corner post, where several prints overlapped as if a group had stood there for some time, looking toward the road. Then they turned and went back north into the state forest. I stood at that corner post for a long time. I counted the sets again. 4. Abel and Cain made 2. There were 2 more I had never encountered, and they had been on my fence line at the corner post, looking at the road, and then they had left. I walked the entire perimeter of my property that day. North fence line, east tree line, south field edge, western road frontage. The prints were only on the north. Whatever had come from the north, walked my north fence and returned north. A survey, that is what it was. I understood this with a military certainty I could not talk myself out of. Something had come to assess my property, and I was no longer the only one making decisions about what happened here. I should tell you about the 3 nights before I tell you about the final days, because those 3 nights are what this title is about, and I haven't earned them yet without the context, but I'm close. The 3 nights in November 2007 were the culmination of something that had been building since at least April of that year, possibly longer, possibly since the very beginning, if I'm willing to follow the thread all the way back. By October, I had seen Abel 4 times in settings that alarmed me in retrospect, not aggressive, Not threatening in any direct sense, but agitated in a way I hadn't seen before. She moved differently in those October sightings. The deliberate stillness was gone. She paced the tree line once, east to west and back, for 20 minutes while I stood on my porch and watched. She was not watching me. She was watching the northern sky. The calls from the eastern woods had become nightly by October, and the responding calls the ones I'd been hearing since late summer of 2006 and telling myself were echoes, or wildlife were closer, geographically closer. Whatever Abel had been answering from the North Forest was moving south, and Cain was restless in a way that broke my heart a little because I recognized it. I had been restless in exactly that way before I left the army, before I left my marriage. The restlessness of something that knows it is about to leave but hasn't left yet. I left food at the tree line the last week of October, and it went untouched for 3 nights running. That had never happened before. When it finally disappeared on the 4th night, it was not in the morning the way it usually was. It was gone by midnight, and I know this because I checked at midnight and it was there, and I checked at 2 in the morning and it was not. Something had come quickly and taken it and gone, and the next morning I found the north fence line prints again, more of them this time, 7 distinct sets, and they had not stayed at the corner post. They had walked the entire north fence both ways slowly, and at the midpoint of the north fence one set had stopped and faced south, toward my house, and stood there for long enough to press the prints 3/4 of an inch into cold October ground, long enough that water had seeped into the impressions and begun to freeze at the edges. The first night was November the 4th. I know the date because I wrote it in the composition notebook and drew a box around it, which was my notation for something significant. I had gone to bed at 10, which was normal, and I woke at 1:17 in the morning. I can see the clock face as clearly now as I could then to a sound outside that I had no category for. I have tried to describe this sound in my notes, and I have never gotten it right. It was not the juvenile sound, and it was not Abel's chest thunder. It was something that operated in a lower register than either of those, felt rather than heard, and it had a cadence, a deliberate, patterned repetition that communicated intent the way a knock on a door communicates intent. Not aggression, not panic. Intent. I got up and went to the window, and I did not turn on any lights. The moon was nearly full, and the back field was silver and still. At the north edge of the field, at the line where the mown grass meets the pasture I keep rough, there was a row of figures. I counted. Not carefully, I was not calm enough for careful counting, but I counted. There were 5. 5 figures standing in a line across the northern field margin, evenly spaced, each at least 7 feet, the largest closer to 8, standing with the stillness that I now recognized as deliberate. The assessment, stillness. They were looking at my house. I stood at my window in the dark for a long time. None of them moved. And then Abel stepped out of the eastern tree line, to my left, and she walked across the field to them, and she stood with them for what I estimate was 5 minutes. And then she walked back to the eastern tree line and was gone. And then the 5 figures on the northern margin turned all together, at once, which was the part that hit me hardest, and walked north back into the darkness. The second night, November the 5th, they were at the south field edge. 4 figures this time, including one I had not seen before, smaller than the adults but clearly not Cain, built differently, moving with a deliberateness that felt female, if I can say that without overstepping. They stood at the south edge for perhaps 20 minutes while I watched from the dark kitchen. Then they left. Cain appeared briefly at the eastern tree line after they had gone and made a sound I had never heard him make short, with a downward pull at the end, and he made it twice, and then he was gone too. The third night, November the 6th, nothing appeared. I waited at the window from 11 until 4 in the morning. The field was empty. The night was still. The only thing different was this: by the eastern tree line, at the spot where Abel most often sat in the evenings, there was something on the ground that had not been there the previous night. I went out at first light to look at it. It was Kane's collection: the blue glass, the silver spoon, the shotgun shells, the white quartz, laid out on a flat stone in the configuration he kept them in under the shelving rock, brought here and placed deliberately at the edge of where our worlds met. I picked up the spoon, my mother's spoon, and I held it in my hand, and I said, "Okay, Kane, okay. I want to be precise about what happened next, because precision is the only courtesy I can offer to the truth of it. I did not see them leave. There was no goodbye scene, no final moment of contact that I can hold up as a defined ending. What there was absence. By November the 8th, the eastern woods had a quality I hadn't felt since before the spring of 2005, a straightforward, uncomplicated emptiness. No peripheral movement in the tree line, no prints at the creek bed, no calls at dusk or in the deep night. I walked the entire eastern section that morning, slowly, to the shelving rock where Kane kept his arrangement. The objects were gone. He had taken everything he wanted to take. I kept walking east, further than I usually went, into the state forest, and I walked for 2 hours through the November woods. I found their shelter site eventually not a constructed shelter, not a den in the animal sense, but an area under a heavy granite overhang where the ground was compressed and there were signs of long, regular occupation. Hair caught in the rough bark of a fallen log, darker than any animal I hunted. The remains of bones, cleanly separated, stacked with the same organizational quality as Kane's collection. And in the soil at the edge of the overhang, a series of shallow gouges in the earth that I looked at for a long time before I accepted what they were. They were not random. They had the structured repetition of meaning. I have never shown them to anyone. I have a photograph, the only photograph I ever took, that lives in an envelope in the back of a drawer in my bedroom. I look at it sometimes. I am not ready to share it. I walked home, and I did not go back to that overhang. By December, life had resumed its ordinary shape in the way that loss always does, eventually not healed, not resolved, but covered over by the daily requirements of living. I cut firewood. I drove to town. Linda called on Sundays. I kept the composition notebook, but I wrote less in it, and what I wrote was shorter, more compressed. The entries of a man who had stopped processing out loud and moved everything inside. There were 2 things that did not resolve. The first, in March of 2008, I found a set of prints along the eastern fence line, a single set, small, with the characteristic slightly inward angle of Kane's gait. One pass, north to south, along the fence and then back north. Whether he came to check on me, or whether I am constructing meaning from the behavior of a wild thing that had moved on and circled back by chance, I genuinely cannot tell you. I have no way to know. I have thought about it for 19 years. The second, on a night in August 2008, I woke at 2 a.m. to a sound from the eastern woods. One sound, brief, upward, lifting at the end. The question sound, the one that had been Kane's first language with me, the one I had heard 100 times in the field at dusk. Once, then silence. I lay in the dark for a long time. Then I got up and went to the back door and opened it and stood in the warm August night, and I answered it the way I had always answered, by being visible and still in the dark. Nothing appeared, nothing came to the field, but the silence after was different from the silence before, if that makes sense. Less empty. I went back to bed. I don't know what that was. I have a theory and I keep it to myself. I told you at the beginning that there is one thing I have never shared. There is a moment, in the first night of those 3 nights in November, when the 5 figures were standing at my north field margin, there is a moment just before Abel came out to join them. In the moonlight, standing still with all the deliberate weight that she always carried, Abel turned her head toward my window, not toward the house, toward the specific window where I was standing, and she held that look for several seconds, and in the moonlight I could see her eyes copper amber, clear and steady, and she said something. Not a vocalization, not the chest thunder or the complex call and response. She said 2 words in a sound that was almost but not quite structured like language, and the words, as close as I have ever been able to reconstruct them, were "thank you." I know what you're thinking. I know exactly what you're thinking because I thought it myself for about 3 years after. Projection, auditory pareidolia, the sound pattern seeking that human brains are famously susceptible to, especially under emotional stress and in low light conditions and in the presence of things we want to believe. I know all of that. I have argued every side of it. I am a plain-spoken man who mistrusts sentiment, and I am telling you she said it. 2 syllables, correctly weighted, the rising inflection of a closing phrase, and then she walked across the silver field to them. I have never told anyone that. Not even Linda. I am telling you now because I am 71 years old and my cardiologist used that word, and because Kane's collection is in a cigar box in my bedroom and my mother's silver spoon is back where it belongs, and because every August, when the night air comes through the screen door, I listen for a sound I have not heard in 17 years, and am not sure I will ever hear again. And because whatever they were, whatever name the scientists would give them when they eventually, inevitably, find the evidence that cannot be ignored, they were here. They were real. They made choices. They kept their own counsel, and they moved through a world that had no room for them. And they let me exist in the margin of that world for 2 years. And when they left with more grace than most people manage. I am not asking you to believe me. I am 71 years old, and I have nothing left to prove to anyone. I am just asking you to keep it with you, the way I've kept it, the way it keeps me.